3 years ago, Britain's Conservative government promised to come up with an official definition of Islamophobia. But now it appears work on that has stopped. As the country marks Islamophobia Awareness Month, some have suggested that when it comes to dealing with anti-Muslim hate crime, the country is going backwards. Welcome to the programme. I'm Philip Hampshire. The optics for the British government aren't good. Its failure to legally define what Islamophobia actually is comes at a time when the issue appears ever more pronounced. The number of religious hate crimes recorded by police that target Muslims in England and Wales rose 42% in the year to March. Every other UK political party in Parliament has agreed on a definition of Islamophobia. However, it's reported that the Tory minister in charge of making it official is opposed to the idea. That's the Communities Secretary Michael Gove, and he said that he would be concerned that it raises issues about freedom of speech. But has the Conservative government given a free pass, therefore, on Islamophobia? Joining us on the panel to discuss this further, all of them in London, we have Sameer Afzal, who is co-founder of the Labour Muslim Network and anti-racist activist. We have Calvin Robinson, who is Conservative political commentator and a GB News presenter, and Rashan Saleha, who is an editor over at the British Muslim news site 5 Pillars. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining me. If I may start out with you, Sameer, what do you make of the fact that the Conservative government in the UK cannot reach an agreement on whether or not it wishes to progress a definition for Islamophobia?
It's really disappointing that the Conservative Party, the party of government that's supposed to set an example in eradicating and tackling racism across the UK, is actually the one political party and the one government that won't accept a widely accepted definition of Islamophobia. It's really concerning to Muslim communities because this is also coupled with a track record of not dealing with Islamophobia when it comes up within the party itself. We've seen hundreds of complaints go into the Conservative Party and really not receive the attention that British Muslims feel that they deserve. And when you combine that with a lack of interest in, I say lack of interest, but it's a little bit more than that when you appoint an independent advisor on Islamophobia and then sack them without ever having done any work on Islamophobia. So it's incredibly concerning that there is no will, no concern, and certainly no plan to tackle Islamophobia in all of its guises across the UK from any Conservative government over the last 10 years.
Well, you mentioned there the definitions of Islamophobia. Obviously, you are affiliated with the Labour Party. So let's pull up the Labour Party's definition of Islamophobia here in the UK. This is the definition they've gone with. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. Now, obviously, that's the Labour Party's definition. So if we go and have a look at the 2019 all-party parliamentary group on British Muslims, they proposed this definition for Islamophobia, which is: Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness and perceived Muslimness. Those are the same definition. So if they can agree that, and the Labour Party can agree that, Calvin, I realise you are not a representative of the Conservative Party. Nonetheless, what do you feel about the fact that these are two different groups, they've reached the same conclusion? Why do you think the Conservative Party can't get there?
I suppose some consensus would be nice. It would be very good for Muslims in this country to know that they are cared for and cared about, and that there will be no discrimination towards Muslims. However, the terminology is tricky. What does Muslimness mean? I know what Islam means, I know what Muslim means. I don't know what Muslimness means. And I suppose people might struggle with the idea that Islamophobia is racist. It's a form of discrimination, it's a form of prejudice, but to be Muslim isn't a race. So these are all, you can see the points of contention. You can see why they're struggling with the actual definition. It's not as universal as other forms of discrimination. But then even that, discrimination is already illegal under the UK law, and people who are discriminatory or prejudiced should be prosecuted accordingly.
So your feeling is that the discrimination is covered in other aspects of anti-discriminatory law in the UK, and so therefore adding an extra layer on top of that just creates more confusion, more bureaucracy?
Yeah, of course. But also we have freedom of religion in this country, but we also have freedom of expression. We have to be careful that whilst we want to clamp down on discrimination and prejudice at all costs, in all forms, we also have to be open to criticism. And we can't see criticism as discrimination, because then we get into very dodgy waters of blasphemy laws and people not being able to address concerns with certain things. And that is important in a free nation.
Roshan, if I can bring you in here, how do you feel about that?
Well, as a journalist, I do want an environment where we can have free speech in this country. I don't think Muslims really want special favors, and they're not trying to shut down criticism. I think what we would like to see happen is for blatant Islamophobia, which provokes hatred and even violence, that to be outlawed. I mean, it'd be interesting to know whether Calvin, given what he just said about freedom of speech, would oppose the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Which is basically the Islamophobic definition that the APPG came up with, is basically a carbon copy of that. So if you're going to have one, you have to have the other. But I basically feel that it's not surprising that
may I put it to you then? Should you have either, if it's already covered by other forms of discrimination law? And obviously, if you're going around throwing bricks at a building. Throwing bricks at a building is throwing bricks at a building and therefore a crime, regardless of whether it's a synagogue or whether it's a temple or whether it's a church.
I think personally that both the IHRA definition and the Islamophobia definition are a little bit too tight. I am all for minority groups being protected from hate speech and incitement to violence. But I think some of the examples in both the IHRA definition and the Islamophobia definition are too tight. For example, the IHRA definition, basically it's a pro-Israel lobby definition of anti-Semitism. And any harsh criticism of Israel makes you basically an anti-Semite, which makes basically all pro-Palestinians anti-Semites. And I think similarly with the Islamophobia definition that the APPG came up with, there are certain things in there, most of it I'm comfortable with, one or two things like saying that Muslims are more loyal to the Ummah than to Britain. I don't consider that Islamophobia. That's free speech, that's fair criticism.
Do we not have an issue here, Samaya, that one person would regard as free speech, another person would regard as Islamophobia? And of course, even within the Islamic world itself, different branches of Islam would regard different things as being Islamophobic. That's simply the nature of human beings.
I think the benefit of this being a UK discussion is that it takes into account the experiences of British Muslims and the way that they are discriminated against domestically when it comes to employment, health, education, and all sorts of arenas. When it comes to freedom of speech, that's often cited as something to be concerned about when it comes to how people are able to talk about Islam or talk about Muslims. But the key thing is that with a discriminatory lens, when you are advocating for the removal of Muslims from the UK, or if you don't want to hire them because they're Muslim, or if you have certain beliefs that Muslims are particularly violent or particularly oppressive to women, or in a way that kind of goes above and beyond what you would consider, or how you would treat other communities. I think that's that's where that demarcation occurs. It's very easy to kind of point to things like, oh, Muslimness isn't a thing, or Islam isn't a race, but actually Muslims in the UK are incredibly racialized as a community, incredibly targeted based on certain markers. So whether you wear the hijab like I do, you are much, much more likely to face Islamophobic abuse. But even those women who don't still face Islamophobic abuse, still face certain barriers when it comes to expressing yourself. So I think it's often a false kind of dichotomy that's presented. If we have a definition, I'm not here to talk about specific definitions, but if we have a definition, it will impact on freedom of speech. I don't think it's quite as clear cut as that. It's actually a call from British Muslim communities who are facing, the second most hated group in the UK statistically. And when you look at the Conservative Party, the fact that 57% of current Conservative Party members have a negative attitude towards Muslims, that hostility is something that needs to be addressed. And hostility isn't an expression of freedom of speech; it's actually an abuse of it. So that's what I would say about that. But also,
Samaya,
I think.
Samaya, you
Yeah.
mentioned there Muslims come in the United Kingdom as the second most hated group, particularly if you take the figures for England and Wales. The group that comes in for the most abuse, relatively speaking, is the Irish traveller and gypsy communities. Calvin, how do you feel about what's been said so far? You're in favour of the freedom of speech argument. I presume you're also against this on a basis that the UK doesn't generally enforce blasphemy laws.
I am indeed. I find the idea quite terrifying. Let's not forget the teacher from Batley Grammar is still in hiding for his life just for a conversation around blasphemy in the classroom. So there are definitely elements of this in this country of people that do want to outlaw certain topics and certain criticism and certain conversations. So it is reaching that level. So I don't think we can brush that under the carpet. And in this country, we need to always remain impartial to freedom of religion and freedom of expression. Just in this conversation alone, we've heard terms like, we shouldn't be able to incite hate or violence. We shouldn't be able to incite violence, but who draws the line on what is hate and what is not hate? That's always the problem with these, people wanting to clamp down on free speech. People who say things like we should have hate speech laws. What is hate speech? And it usually comes down to language that people find harmful. Well, this is always subjective. The law should be focused on things that are objective. Otherwise, we fall into very sketchy ground. And that's where I think we're going with this conversation.
Do you have any response to Roshan earlier, who was making the comment that the definition for Islamophobia that was being mooted was in fact merely the definition for anti-Semitism with the words swapped around?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit frustrating that we can't ever have a conversation about Islam without talking about Judaism. However, if we want to get into that whataboutery, there are many, many people who are Jewish culturally and ethnically, but not religiously. So I think there is a slight difference between the Jews being seen as a race versus Islam is more of is a religion. And my colleague just said that Muslim is being racialized. Well, surely we need to tone that down. Then, if that's the problem, rather than increase it by saying we need special racial laws for Islamophobia, why not just re-emphasize the laws around discrimination and prejudice for all people and say that it's unacceptable to be prejudiced or discriminatory towards anyone? Surely that's the approach we should be taking. Let's de-escalate, not.
Roshan, I see you shaking your head there.
I think it's very difficult to demarcate, to kind of separate race and religion when it comes to Islamophobia. I really do, because the fact is, the vast majority of Muslims in this country and around the world, they're black or brown, and when we suffer Islamophobia, we're often suffering because anybody who is a Muslim in this country, a brown, black Muslim, will have suffered Islamophobia and racism often at the same time. So I think to demarcate it like that is just too convenient. And I think ultimately right-wing Islamophobes would like us to do that, because then they can have a field day, they can call Prophet Muhammad all sorts of names and get away with it, and get away with it scot-free, quite frankly. So
someone can. I'm a Christian. Someone can call Jesus whatever they like. It won't affect my faith in Jesus, and they're free to do so in this country. But you just suggested that they shouldn't be able to call the Prophet Muhammad whatever they like.
If I could
ask
Samaya, let me bring you in at this moment.
Because I think it's really important to understand where it comes from. I don't think that when people criticize, but it's more than criticize, it's belittle, undermine the beliefs of Muslims, but it's against a wider backdrop of proving that they are barbaric, or that they are uncivilized, or that they can't integrate, or that they have a particular propensity towards violence or towards certain things. It's building up the idea of Muslims, and you have to take the context into account. It's not just random ad hoc comments here and there. It's with an intention to mark out Muslims as inherently incapable of integrating into British society. So I think that's the difference. People can call each other names, But when it comes to trying to build a narrative around Muslims in the UK, that's what happens. So you can't just talk about it as though
if
it's
you
meaningless,
had
sort of like.
if you had a full law on Islamophobia, I mean, you said people can call one another names. The point of a law like that is actually a whole host of names wouldn't be included and would suddenly become some form of hate speech then. So
No, that's not necessarily what it means.
not
What it means is that
necessarily, but these things do tend to creep. There does tend to be expansion in how laws are
has there been
implemented.
I mean, I want to refer back to the Equality Act 2010. Yes. Has there been an expansion on what you can and can't say based on what's in the Equality Act? It's yes. Often said, well, it's a creeping movement, but if anything, we see huge amounts of racism in the UK, not just targeted towards Muslims, towards Black people, towards Irish travelers, towards Jews. Like, there's so many minority communities that are suffering at the moment. Would you kind of say that they don't deserve protection based on where a certain conversation might go, or where people might be criminalized? Actually, what we're saying is the really serious kinds of Islamophobia in the country are not the way that people talk about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, or the way that the words that people particularly use. Even though there's a huge focus on that, the names that you're called, actually it's institutional. It's the discrimination that you face when you go to get your insurance as a Muslim with a Muslim-sounding name. It's when you're stopped at borders, put through enhanced security. It's when your community is surveilled through Prevent and has a great amount of surveillance in other ways. It's when if Muslim governors at a school are involved, then it's an issue to kind of find out exactly what they're doing. It's institutional. It's not the name calling and the things that you might kind of commonly associate with so-called Islamophobic attitudes. It's the way that discrimination is completely and utterly systematic in the UK, and dealing with that. And I find that it's a distraction when you focus on certain things. That's not to say that
well, hold on.
Making sure that.
Let me bring in here, let's look at some of the scale of the problem if we can. I mean, immediately after Boris Johnson referred to Muslim women wearing veils as looking like letterboxes or bank robbers, he did this a few years ago now, violent incidents against British Muslims rose by some 375%. If we take Annalise Dodds, who is a Labour MP here in the UK, she's gone on the record as saying, and I quote, "Hate crimes against Muslims accounted for 42% of all recorded religious hate crimes last year. The Conservatives promised to develop a definition of Islamophobia years ago. Now Michael Gove says he won't. Another broken Tory promise." Calvin, how do you feel about that? Do you feel that the Conservative Party has perhaps walked back on a commitment to people that had said, no, we are going to move something more in this direction?
I do. I think if they say they're going to do this, then they should follow through and do it. And I think we're getting sick and tired of broken promises, from all politicians. Doesn't matter what party we're talking about. But I also see the problems here in that a lot of what we've just heard from my colleague on the right has been conflation of points. Saying things like, "Do we not want to protect people?" Of course we want to protect people. I don't think there's anyone out here saying we don't want to protect people. But then saying that the Equalities Act hasn't been, we haven't seen creep from that, and we have seen creep from that. I'm sure we've seen creep that many of us on this panel today would agree with. We've seen people arrested and locked up for saying that there are only two sexes and you cannot change sex. We've seen people, police knocking on people's doors for suggesting that marriage is between a man and woman. We've seen lots of things that are traditional views being seen as problematic for certain protected minorities now, based on the Equalities Act. So we have seen lots of creep in the way that we see our culture and the way that we're allowed to express ourselves within it.
Rashan, if I can bring you in here. I've seen a lot of head nodding from you, and a lot of head shaking.
I mean, look, if I can just briefly answer Calvin's point from earlier on. The reason why Muslims get more offended by Christians, if I can be frank here, is because Christianity is a dying religion in the UK. People don't care about Christianity anymore. That's why the churches are empty, whereas the mosques are full. And that is the reason why Muslims, they take their religion seriously. Look, Muslims are about 4 million people in this country, okay? And we are part and parcel of Britain. So our views should be taken into account. We're living in a multicultural society. We all have to get along with each other. Just as the views of, I don't know, Jews, homosexuals, Hindus, Buddhists have to be taken into account, so do the views of Muslims. And that's all we're asking for, not special favors. In terms of the, can I finish or?
Yeah, you keep.
Yeah, no, because what you're saying is problematic.
Calvin,
you're suggesting that, first of all, suggesting that you're antagonistic. It's just that Christianity is a dying faith, and that's why Islam needs more protection, because it's a growing faith. Well, surely then Christianity is a minority that needs to be protected, especially when everyone's able to trance all over it. But to suggest one thing about the Islamic faith, and you have to get hidden away for security, for protection of your life, like Salman Rushdie, like the teacher in Batley Spen, this is incorrect. This is inappropriate. This is against British values. To suggest that there is one group or one religious group that needs more protection than others is incorrect. All religious groups should deserve the same amount of protection. But then to also suggest that there are certain things you can only say about one group that you can't say about others because Christianity is dying, so therefore it's okay to be disparaging. No, that's more reason to protect Christianity along with Muslims, surely and surely.
Rashan.
There's an implicit bias in everything that you're saying.
Because look, I don't condone violence or criminality, but the fact is, if you shout fire in a cinema, like if you insult the Prophet Muhammad, you're literally shouting fire in a crowded room, okay? And that will lead to an incendiary situation. These are facts. These are facts. Because Muslims care very deeply about their religion. Now, obviously, any reaction, violent reaction or whatever, should be dealt with by the criminal law. But we live in a multicultural society. We have to get on with each other. Look, I just want to make a point because I keep on getting interrupted. The Conservative Party are the party of Islamophobia in this country. We all know that. We all know that they believe crazy things like no-go Sharia zones exist in this country. We all know that most Conservative Party
literally everything you say is disgustingly antagonistic, incendiary, and just disrespectful. You're not here for reasonable debate.
I have to cut across you there, Rashan, and give the, for instance, if we were holding this discussion in the early 1990s, and we would have in the room with me right now somebody from the Labour Party and somebody from the Conservative Party, the position of somebody from the Labour Party might easily have been that Muslim women wearing veils is in some way anti-feminist, and they might be in favour of removing those veils. Meanwhile, somebody from the Conservative Party in the early 1990s would have said, no, that's outrageous. Muslim women should be allowed to dress as they wish. If you were to look at the political positions of the two parties today, they've more or less swapped places. Meanwhile, in France, they have veil law rows quite continuously and relentlessly within that country. Political positions on what counts as Islamophobia and what doesn't, and where the dividing lines are, morph and twist over time. They evolve and they ebb and they flow. Is that not going to be a difficulty if you try and pin down in law, this counts as Islamophobic, this does not? Does it not ossify everything? Rashan.
To be honest, I didn't really understand your question, but I would like to just say that, we shouldn't just focus on the Conservatives here. The Labour Party are just as bad. They pay lip service to fighting Islamophobia, but in reality, we've seen Keir Starmer go on an anti-Muslim witch hunt, basically accusing so many Muslims of anti-Semitism when all they were pro-Palestinian. We've seen his positions on Israel, Palestine, and Kashmir, places like that. The Labour vote is being decimated amongst Muslims. Muslims overwhelmingly will not vote Labour in the next election. They have no political home at the moment, and that is because they are treated differently from other minorities in the society through the media, through politicians. We are being driven out of mainstream public life. It's Islamophobia Awareness Month. Shema Dalali, the head of the NUS, National Union of Students, has been sacked for a tweet she made 10 years ago when she was 17 years old. This is what is happening to Muslims in this country. It needs to be addressed urgently.
Thank you for that. Samaya, what are your feelings on that charge that was made by Rashan, that actually Muslims have no political home in the UK at the moment?
I certainly agree that there are huge challenges when it comes to Muslims being able to find a political home. Certainly when it comes to Islamophobia, the Labour Muslim Network has produced 2 reports so far on the scale of Islamophobia within the Labour Party. That's something we've taken directly to the leadership as well, and challenged them on their actions, on their promises, on their words. So I would say that no political party is beyond being challenged and being and understanding the scale of it within their own party, and also putting together a vision and a plan to tackle Islamophobia should they end up in government. So I don't think that any political party is beyond that challenge. What I would say is that we have a very specific problem when it comes to the Conservative Party. They have been in government for the last 10 years. They have made promises and they've broken them. So much of the Conservative membership that elected the last prime minister, and then the party appointed the latest one. But so many of them have really regressive and discriminatory views about Muslims. It's not too far of a reach to say that maybe not dealing with Islamophobia or having Islamophobic policies is something that actually benefits the Conservative Party.
Samira Afzal, thank you very much for joining us. Calvin Robinson, Roshan Saleh, thank you very much to both of you as well. It was a very contentious debate, and I understand why it's difficult to come on television and talk about these matters. I thank you all for doing that with us today. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye, and thank you for watching.